Hello, everybody. This is the Quiz 1 results review for industry analysis. A long time coming, and of course there were delays because of students returning and taking and completing the quiz at different times, and then just delays on my own part, so I apologize for that. I think this could be very valuable, though. It is actually, as you'll see, not just a review of the quiz itself. I think there's some material here that I certainly haven't presented in class that sort of deepens some of the explanation of why these, the thinking behind these quiz questions. And as I mentioned before, my goal is not to have these quizzes be just about evaluation, but also about education as well, and also provide an opportunity. And I think this presentation will do that. Before I get started, I do want to point out I'm recording this on a Friday night at home, because that's how I roll on my Friday nights. But with that in mind, I do have a dog here in the background and other things that might disrupt. So please excuse any noises, and I might have to pause it or even do this in parts, depending on how things go and whether I get interrupted or not, but we'll see. All right, so with that said, again, the first thing probably to talk about in terms of the Quiz 1 results review is the overall results. And so this is the frequency histogram of the scores, of the score distribution. Although I think this was, I downloaded this data a little before. There are a few more that were straggling in at this point, but for the most part, 99% of all the quiz scores are represented here. And you'll see that, first of all, the median score was a 90, the average was close to an 87. Much higher scores than, for example, we got in the BE quizzes, so that suggests, I think that's a positive thing. But it does affect, as you sort of see the distribution, a lot of people getting, 0 or 1, 2 questions wrong. We decided to, as you see the designation there of what we consider, we will curve the scores as we did with business economics, but what we will then adjust to be within the A range, the A minus range, B plus range, B, and then a B minus range based on how you scored. It is the case that for whatever reason, Eisenhower does not allow a score of a 95, so that means if you got 100 on this exam, it'll actually get scaled down to a 95, which is a little weird, but that's the way Eisenhower does it. But again, this gives you some idea of the distribution. You sort of know where you, if you can sort of figure out what your score was, where you lay in the distribution, both what that means for your grade, but also where you are, your relative performance relative to your colleagues. So what I'm going to, now out of the 15, there were, of course, 20 questions, and for 15 out of the 20 questions, at least 80% of the students answer those correctly. Right, so those were the ones. So this is typically the case. There's a few, the scores are affected by a few particular questions. There's some that 100% of students or 99% of students got right. So there's some questions that were not very challenging, but there were these 5 challenging questions that less than 80% answered correctly. And so I'm going to go into some detail on each of these questions: 10, 14, 18, 19, 20. It's interesting to note that 18, 19, 20, the last 3 questions are on this list. So I do have to wonder whether those questions were difficult or just sort of the end of the test. People had less time to work on those, so that could be certainly a factor as well. But regardless, I will go over those 5 questions in some detail. There are also 2 other questions that are sort of borderline questions that just over 80%, between 80 to 85% answer correctly. And so I will spend a little time on that. I'm actually going to go through all 20 questions, but I will go very quickly, probably too quickly through most of them. But for the 5 challenging ones and the 2 borderline ones, I'll spend a little extra time and present some backup slides for most of these that sort of explain the thinking behind that question and the answers. Okay, so again, just going through them in order. So this one, you'll see my icon here in the upper right, this happy face thumbs up icon. That means that at least like 85% or 90% or more of the students got this one correct. So when you see a thumbs up, I'm not going to talk much about those questions because everybody pretty much got those questions right. But I will say, a few words at least to use this as an educational opportunity. Question 1, which the following is most appropriate as a measure of business value creation. And you'll remember from lesson IA1, we talked about the important measure of value creation was return on invested capital above the cost of capital, right? And again, this is the idea of what is your return and what did it cost you to get that, right? What's your return above and beyond the cost incurred? Of course, just to give you some idea of why other ones are problematic, revenue is problematic because, of course, it doesn't include cost at all, just revenue. You could be losing money even if you're measuring by revenue. Accounting profit, of course, we know does not include, implicit costs, opportunity costs, things like that. So it doesn't really measure overall value created. Consumer surplus, of course, only reflects the value created for the consumer, not necessarily for the firm. Again, the firm could be making no money, could be losing money. So consumer surplus is not a good measure. And return on sales, of course, is just simply the margin, per unit. It doesn't reflect your volume or total value created, et cetera. So again, not a good measure of value creation. So instead we go with return on invested capital above the cost of capital. Question 2 on financial risk, again, another thumbs up question. Everybody got this right, or most people got this right. Which type of risk reflects the ability of a firm to pay short-term expenses and is often assessed by looking at the current ratio? What is the current ratio, by the way? The current ratio is of simply your current assets over current liabilities, right? Basically, what do you have that in current assets are things that can be, are less than a year. Current liabilities, current is always less than or equal to a year. And again, this means basically what do we have that's liquid that we could use to pay our liabilities, and what are those liabilities in the short term, right? So this is a measure of that. And the 2 types of risks that we talked about, actually, I've got 4 risks listed here, but the reality is that the only 2 we talked about in the class were liquidity risk and solvency risk. Liquidity risk is basically, are you liquid? Do you have the cash? Do you have the assets? This is what we're talking about with the current ratio, right? Are you able to pay your current expenses? Whereas solvency risk is the other risk we talked about in the class, and that is sort of, are you able to pay your debts in the long run, right, over a longer period of time, as opposed to the short, current sort of time period. So the answer here is liquidity risk. We didn't talk about these notions of operating risk, competitive risk, exactly what they mean. Those weren't things we brought up in the course, at least not at this point explicitly. Question 3 was about financial statements. A firm's assets and liabilities appear on which type of financial statement, right? Again, that is your balance sheet. Your balance sheet is where your assets and liabilities are, right? It's not your incomes and loss of the income statement. It's not the cash flows. It's not the discussion of financial conditions. So again, the balance sheet is where you are balancing your assets versus your liabilities. Question 4, again, all these are thumbs up so far. Which element of the SCP paradigm or framework is characterized, so again, by such variables as the number and size distribution of buyers and sellers, the extent to which products are differentiated, and how easy it is for other firms to enter the market, right? Those are all industry structure questions. Those are all market structure. Those are all the things we studied in business economics. That, therefore, is, of course, all about the structure of the market, of the industry. So the SCP framework, the element that is characterized by those variables is structure. Question 5 is also with the SCP framework, but it's about what the implications were of the structured conduct performance framework. So which of the following is not an implication of the structured conduct performance framework? So A, industry structure and firm conduct can both influence financial and or economic performance. So again, the structure and conduct influence performance. That is basically the most basic premise of the structured conduct performance framework. B, it says that financial and or economic performance can influence both industry structure and firm conduct. So that just says it goes the other way around. Performance can influence structure and or can influence conduct. Right? We also saw that as well. C says long-run financial and or economic performance should be similar across different industry structures. Now that's actually the opposite of the implication, right? So that's going to be your answer. But again, the idea here is that different industry structures are going to generate different performance. That is what the SCP framework is all about. Different structures equal different performance. Different conduct equals different differences in performance. D, the financial performance of firms subject to the same industry structure will often still vary due to differences in firm behavior or conduct, right? That again is indeed an implication, because it means that it's not only structure, it's also conduct that influences performance. So again, most people got this 90% or more, whatever, got this question right, but answer C was the correct answer. Question 6. So now we get to our first. This is our borderline. You see my icon up there with the not happy, not sad, the meh face, I guess you call it. So this is the first question for which there was some that fewer than 90% got this correct. So, but still more than 80%. But let me spend a little extra time on this. So the question is, which of the following statements about setting performance measures and targets within a firm is not true? Okay. Now I could read you, as you see, there's a lot of words here on your screen. But I'm not going to read them all to you repeatedly. So hold on, let me pause this while I deal with the dog issue. Sorry about that, but it will no doubt happen again. He doesn't listen to me. All right, so, but rather than read you A, B, C, and D, let me just go back to the context of when we learned about performance measures and targets, and then we'll come back and we'll sort of see which answers make sense, are consistent with what our learning was. So on this, remember, this is part of the IA Module 1 on financial analysis, and in particular, it was a lesson on structured conduct performance. But in particular, during that lesson, there were several different topics, but it was ultimately the primary takeaway was this diagram here, the idea of the relationship between structure, conduct, and performance. the fact that there's a causality in red going to the right, meaning structure influences conduct, which influences performance. Structure directly influences performance, but also the green arrows that the feedback loop goes in the other way as well. But there are also the external shocks that could affect any element of that framework. I covered five topics, 5 questions. These are certainly covered in the readings, but I covered these in my class when I sort of talked about structure, conduct, performance in lesson IA2. And the last one I did was about how does performance reflect conduct, right? And this was assigned to everybody in their reading, but how does performance reflect conduct? In particular, what that means is, so this is the idea. So again, you see my heading here, how does performance affect conduct? Well, here was you were assigned a reading from Grant on setting performance targets. There's a selection of from chapter 2 on Grant being the contemporary strategy analysis book. And these are direct quotes. On this slide is one more. This is directly out of the reading. He says, quote, "To be effective, performance targets need to be consistent with long-term goals, linked to strategy, and relevant to the tasks and responsibilities of individual organizational members," right? And there's a trade-off there. Notice it's got to be consistent with long-term goals, linked to strategy, right? So big picture things, but relevant to the tasks and responsibilities of individual organizational members. The instruction to maximize long-run profits is meaningless outside the executive suite, right? If you tell an individual manager, hey, make sure you maximize long-run profits today, that is meaningless. Corporate targets need to be translated into specific goals meaningful for managers further down the organization. The key is to match performance targets to the variables over which different managers exert some control, right? So again, match targets for a manager with what that manager actually controls. And so if you think about this, I sort of created this diagram as I read Grant myself and thought about this idea of a balancing act in setting performance targets. So the idea is, look, performance targets have to first balance. They've got to be aligned with business strategy, right? So in other words, if you achieve those targets, it's going to fulfill the goals of the business strategy. So it's aligned with business strategy. But at the same time, it's got to be within the realm of management control, right? The idea is that it's got to be something that if you give me a target that as a manager, I say, okay, I know what I need to do to sort of move towards that target. It's also, of course, got to have a long-term impact. Again, from the previous slide, talking about long-term goals. So you want to have a long-term impact. The whole point is long-term performance, right? But that said, a manager wants to know, what do they do today? What do I do this week? What do I do this month? It's got to have some short-term relevance, right? It can't be some nebulous sort of performance target that only has a meaning to a manager in the long term. It's got to have some meaning that means, what do I do here in the short term? So that's the sort of balancing act of setting performance targets. Going on, Grant says the following: thus, for the CEO, it makes sense to set the overall goal of maximizing enterprise value. For the chief operating officer and divisional heads, it makes sense to set more specific financial goals, such as investing in projects whose rate of return exceeds the cost of capital. Right? Again, more specific operating targets are preferable for functional, departmental, and unit managers. The same procedures that we use to disaggregate return on capital for praising past performance can be used to set performance targets appropriate to different levels and functions within the organization. Right? So what he's saying is this is a version of a diagram that's actually in the reading on Grant about disaggregating performance into value drivers. Right. So the idea is, look, in the end, we talked about economic value, economic profit, value creation is return on invested capital minus weighted average cost of capital. Those are all the same. These are all about the overall value being created by the business, right? And that might be meaningful to your CEO, right? So that's your CEO should be focused on those sorts of things because the CEO makes choices that actually would influence those things. But as you get lower level, you got to break this down. And I'm not telling you that you should know how to break these down, but return on invested capital minus weighted average cost of capital could actually be broken down into margin and capital turnover, right? Then margin can be broken down into certain things and capital turnover can be broken down. And as you disaggregate these different measures, they're all tied up to the overall value creation for the firm. But as you get into more smaller components of the larger measures, they have more meaning at the lower levels of the organization, right? Until you get to things like, order size, customer mix, all these different things here you see, right? That would mean an individual line manager, would mean something to them. So the individual departments and teams might actually have a performance target that is one of these things on the far right. But the point is that you get these performance targets by disaggregating from overall, corporate level value creation measures, right? So ultimately that ensures, because this ensures the balancing act, right? This ensures that you're achieving overall corporate objectives in terms of value creation, but at the same time, you are using measures that are actually meaningful to individual managers, and meaningful in the short term, not just the long term. One example of these performance measurement or performance management systems is the balanced scorecard. That's also in the reading on Grant, and it talks about this idea that that keeping strategy in the middle that looks at measures in 4 different dimensions here: financial, customer, internal business processes, and learning and growth. So you see these 4 different dimensions here, but in each one you identify the objectives, right? What are you trying to achieve, right? So you set a set of objectives in the financial category or customer category or business process category, and what is the objective you're trying to achieve? And say, okay, then how are you going to measure it? Right? How do you actually quantify that? Right? Whether or not you achieved it. Then you have the target. Say, okay, if I've got a quantified measure of it, how do I know if I'm good enough? What's the target in that? And then finally, initiatives. What do we actually do to actually reach that target? Right. So that's the idea of the balanced scorecard. Right. Again, it's just something you should be aware of as a person understanding business a little bit, but and understand that ultimately though it's just one device, one performance management system that disaggregates overall corporate value creation into individual measures that are meaningful at the managerial level. All right. So with that said, now we can go back to our question answers. Question 6, performance measures, which the following statements about setting performance measures and targets within a firm is not true. So A, performance targets should be consistent with overall strategic goals for the firm, but also relevant to the responsibilities within the control of individual managers, right? That is absolutely true. In fact, it's almost a direct quote from the very beginning of that reading of Grant. That's the high-level idea right there, answer A. Answer B, the most valuable performance measures to motivate and guide managers at all levels of a firm are metrics such as overall enterprise value, long-run economic profit, or corporate return on invested capital. So again, read that one. The most valuable performance measures to motivate and guide managers at all levels of a firm are metrics such as overall enterprise value, long-run economic profit, or corporate return on invested capital. Well, no, we just said that means that outside of the C-suite, that doesn't mean anything, right? That means that those things about overall enterprise value, long-run economic profit, they mean something to your CEO, but they do not mean anything, right, to your individual line managers, right? So that's not a good or valuable performance measure. C, disaggregating firm-level performance measures into component financial or operating measures that closely align with specific business activities can generate a set of performance metrics appropriate for managers at different levels and in different functional areas of the company, right? Exactly, right? C is exactly what we just did in disaggregating overall, firm-level performance into things that are meaningful for individual managers. That's exactly what the process by which you develop good performance measures. And finally, on the balanced scorecard methodology, just some of the description here provides a framework for cascading performance measures down the organization to individual business units and departments by looking at the firm from financial, customer, internal business, and innovation and learning perspectives, right? That's, again, just a definition of what balanced scorecard is, right? So the answer, therefore, because the question asks, which of the following statements about setting performance measures and targets within a firm is not true, the one that is not true is answer B. And so that's how we got to answer B for question 6. All right, question 7. So question 7 was a present value question, and it was one that has another. Now we go back to thumbs up. 90% or more got this question right. Suppose you will receive a cash amount at some point in the future. Which of the following statements about the present value of this future income is true, right? What's the present value of a cash amount in the future? A, the farther in the future the firm receives the cash flow, the larger its present value. So the farther away you are from the money, the higher, more you value it. Well, no, right? The farther away it is, if $1,000 2 years from now is worth less than $1,000 a year from now, right? Or, so the farther away, 20 years from now, the farther away it goes, the lower its present value. So answer A is not correct. B, the larger the future cash flow amount to be received, the smaller its present value. Okay, so, would you rather have $1,000 10 years from now or $5,000 10 years from now? Well, obviously $5,000. So answer B is wrong. The larger the cash flow amount, the larger its present value. So answer C better be the one correct. Let's see. The higher the discount rate, i.e. the interest rate, cost of capital, or opportunity cost of time, the smaller the present value of the future cash flow. Okay, this is saying the higher the discount rate. So what that means is the more you discount the future interest rate. So that is, the higher the discount rate, the less something in the future is worth, right? If every year that I discount, something by 20%, right? If I discount something by 20%, that means that a year from now, I need to get 20% more to have it, a year from now to make it worth the same as it is this year. or 10%, then I don't need as much. The point is that, again, so the higher the discount rate, you're basically saying the higher discount rate, the less valuable things in the future are. So the higher the discount rate, the smaller the present value of the future cash flow. Yes, that's correct. Right? And so that's the answer. Answer is to question 7 is answer C. All right. 8, strategic investment. So again, another thumbs up. So we got this one, and again, 90% of you got this one right. The reading on strategic evaluation of investment under competition suggests that net present value calculations for valuing strategic investments should be supplemented by 3 additional analytical steps. Which of these additional steps incorporates uncertainty into the analysis by integrating the value of options that might become available to the firm as new information opportunities become available, right? So uncertainty, the value of options, depending upon what happens in the future, right? Well, is it positioning analysis? No. Positioning analysis is about how does it position your firm relative to competition. It'll affect the willingness to pay for what you're offering, because it's compared to what's your remember, competitive positioning and competitive advantage is all about willingness to pay and cost. So what is your relative cost? What is your relative willingness to pay? That's positioning analysis. Sustainability analysis is all about the threats we talked about more recently, about things like hold up, slack, substitution, imitation. How will those things affect the sustainability advantage generated from the investment? So that is not about uncertainty or option value, right? Instead, flexibility analysis is about uncertainty. The idea of what if questions. Well, what if this happens? What is our flexibility to exploit option value? Things like that. So again, flexibility analysis is in fact where uncertainty in the value of options comes in. That's question 8. Question 9. Okay, here we got another question. 9 is a meh question. So this is one where between 80 and 90% got correct. So as Nucor was deciding whether or not to invest in a new steel mill that would commercialize CSP technology, suppose that its calculated NPV for the investment was negative, right? Okay, so suppose you did NPV and it was negative, which normally if you just left it there, you would say, okay, don't do it. The net present value is negative. Which of the following considerations might nonetheless sway Nucor to pursue the investment anyway? So let's do the logic here. A, we already talked about what each of these, we talked the last question about what positioning analysis, sustainability analysis, and flexibility analysis are. But let's talk about the scenario described here. So A says, what if the positioning analysis reveals that Nucor's price minus cost margin could be smaller than estimated NPV calculation? Right? So you've done your NPV, it's negative. Then you do positioning analysis, and based on relative willingness to pay and cost, it turns out your margin's lower than you thought. Well, if the margin is lower than you thought and you did your NPV calculation, that is actually makes it the value of the investment go down. It lowers your investment value. It doesn't raise it, right? It says, oh, it's even worse. It was already negative. It's getting even more negative, right? So that is not going to be your answer here. That's not going to convince you to do something that had a negative NPV. What about a sustainability analysis that suggests that substitute technologies could leapfrog CSP technology shortly after the new mill began production, right? Okay, so in other words, what if it turns out that you do your analysis of the CSP mill under the assumption that it will, the current status quo in terms of technology will continue, but instead now you suddenly do a sustainability analysis and you find out there's going to be a substitute. So instead of having 10 years of being, cutting edge on this, you are in fact going to be leapfrogged very quickly. Well, that's not good, right? That's actually going to lower your investment value. So that sort of analysis, again, sustainability analysis, these things could go either way. But the example I'm giving here, if the sustainability analysis suggested that would lower your investment value, so that wouldn't raise your propensity to make the investment. What about a flexibility analysis that indicated that Nucor could gain learning and experience benefits from the initial CSP mill and potentially construct and begin production at a second such mill at much lower capital startup costs, right? So in other words, what if, yeah, you might lose money or not do so well on your first mill, but you're going to learn from that experience so that if you do another one, you're going to have greater returns, lower upfront costs, right? Lower capital startup costs. Okay, well that means that it makes the first investment more attractive, right? So that actually raises your investment value. That creates a higher investment value, right? So of those 3 options, the only one which might sway you to pursue the investment, even though your initial analysis had a negative NPV, the only one that could possibly be the right answer is flexibility analysis, right? The example, the type of flexibility analysis described here. All right, that's question 9. We're actually going to do a little bit out of order. Let me do question 11, then I'll go back to 10. You'll understand why in a second. So question 11 is about value capture. It's a thumbs up question. So this is the one that 90% of you got correct, but just I wanted to put this out there first. Consider a firm which buys inputs from suppliers, uses those inputs to produce products, and sells those products to its buyers, right here. Suppliers, firm to buyers. Using the diagram below, identify the value captured by the firm and the value captured by the buyer, right? So we know that, first of all, we have willingness to pay, buyer's willingness to pay, we have supplier opportunity costs, the buyer buys from this firm at a price, and the price incurs a cost that then goes to the suppliers. So therefore, we've seen that the total value created is going to be the buyer's willingness to pay minus supplier's opportunity costs, right? That's the total value created by this transaction between supplier, firm, and buyer. What the buyer captures, the value captured by the buyer is the willingness to pay minus price, right? Of what they were willing to pay versus what they actually paid. That difference is the surplus, if you will, consumer surplus we talked about in business economics. But again, that is the value captured by the buyer. The supplier was willing to supply at the supplier opportunity cost. What the supplier actually received is what the firm had as their costs. So that's the value captured by suppliers. And then the difference, price minus cost, or the margin there, that is the value captured by the firm. Right? And so since the question asks you, what is the value captured by the firm, what's the value captured by the buyer, right? It'd be these two items here. I can't remember whether it was A and B or where they were labeled in the question itself. But again, 90% of you plus got this one right. But it's helpful to understand that before we get to the more problematic question, which is question 10. This one was a bit challenging. And it's about willingness to pay, cost, and advantage. Question 10 says, a firm cannot have a competitive advantage. True or false? A firm cannot have a competitive advantage unless it, one, generates a willingness to pay, which is higher than the willingness to pay of all rivals, and or two, it incurs a cost to produce that's lower than the cost of all rivals, right? So in other words, you cannot have a competitive advantage unless you have the highest willingness to pay or the lowest cost. Is that true? Well, let's see. So, first of all, to do this, let me step back into our discussion from way back in IA Lesson 4. So, we talked about the what, where, and how strategy, the what being about advantage, the where being about scope, and how being about activities. So, for this particular question, we got to talk about the what portion of this. So, the advantage, what is the unique competitive advantage or added value the organization achieves or seeks to achieve relative to alternatives? Those rivals, substitutes, or entrants. Well, there are sub-questions to that, which are how does the organization's differentiation or willingness to pay compare to its alternatives? How does the organization's cost compare to its alternatives? And then how does the organization's gap between the willingness to pay and cost compared to those alternatives, right? So the willingness to pay, the cost, and the gap between the two. And then this idea of added value, right? So it's really about your gap relative to other competitors' gaps. So we actually, I could say a lot about this, but let's actually go back to, this is why we did question 11 first. So remember, this is what we just showed about value creation and capture. But for our purposes here, we'll use a simplified version. So instead of focusing on customer, firm, and suppliers, just focus about customers and the firm. The firm has some cost it incurs. Customers have some willingness to pay. And so the difference between willingness to pay and cost is the total value created by this transaction of the firm selling to the customer. And the price is what the customer pays. Then the willingness to pay minus price is the value captured by the customer. And the price minus cost is the value captured by the firm. Right? That's a simplified version. We're ignoring sort of the supply side interaction and the value captured between the firm versus its suppliers. So, with that said, remember we introduced these various types of competitive advantage, right? So the types of competitive advantage, we talked about differentiation advantage and low cost advantage. These are the most common ones that we think about. So first on the left, differentiation advantage. In this example, we said that firm A has a differentiation advantage, right? And firm A is differentiated. The willingness to pay for firm A's product is higher than its competitor, firm B, right? And it does have a higher cost, but the reason it has an advantage is not because the higher willingness to pay, but because it has a higher gap to willingness to pay and cost, right? The value created, willingness to pay minus cost, is greater for firm A than firm B. So firm A is differentiated, but the reason it has an advantage is because it has a greater gap to willingness to pay and cost. Over here, we have a low cost advantage. Here, firm C has a low cost advantage relative to firm D, right? Again, firm C has a lower cost. It's in a low cost position, and it gives it an advantage because even though it has a lower willingness to pay, the gap to willingness to pay and cost is greater for firm C than firm D, right? 6, the value created for this transaction over here from firm C is 6, 8 minus 2, versus 9 minus 4 or 5 for firm D. So that was differentiation low cost advantage. Remember, we then talked about the dual advantage, right? The fact that you actually would have higher willingness to pay and lower cost. Firm E has a dual advantage relative to its competitor, firm F. And then the one that's important for this question, and the one that if you want to understand these concepts that you need to understand, that I said that in the lecture, is this one, the idea of a mixed advantage, right? the idea that, think about, in this case, firm G, both firm G is compared with firm H and firm I, right? And the issue is firm G has a mixed advantage. It does not have the highest willingness to pay. It does not have the lowest cost among its competitors, but it has the biggest gap between willingness to pay and cost, right? And it has a competitive advantage. To illustrate that, remember we did these little exercises. I went through this idea of competitive pricing and value captures. Let's talk about what happened when we did that for the mixed advantage example. So in this example, right, suppose these three firms, G, H, and I, are trying to compete for one customer or one group of customers are all the same, right? The idea is they're each going to have to offer that customer the most value capture, which means willingness to pay minus price, right? So what they do is they compete. They each offer a lower price to try to attract the customer, right? And the customer is going to choose not who has the lowest price, but who gives the biggest bang for the buck. In other words, whoever offers the greatest willingness to pay minus price. Well, they compete that way. They end up with prices approximately there, right? The idea being that firm G, right? They each can, and when this happens, right? Firm H will offer a price of 4. It can't offer any lower than 4. That's its cost. Firm I will offer a price of 1. It can't offer a price lower than 1. That's its cost. Can't profitably do so, right? So it's offering value to the customer of in this case 9 minus 4 or 5. Here 6 minus 1 or 5. They're each offering a value of 5. Firm G can then offer, say, $2.99, right? But it still offer the customer a value of 5, maybe $5.01, right? And yet have profit left over. These two firms cannot make a profit competing this way, right? So neither H nor I can make a profit. And the reason is because, remember, we talked about this, the key to having a competitive advantage is having a greater gap between one's pay and cost, right? So in this example, right, so what happens is firm G ends up capturing about 1, right, rounded to the nearest dollar. Firm H captures nothing. Firm I captures nothing, right? And that's why firm G has the advantage in this scenario. So firm H, notice firm H is the highest willingness to pay out of these three firms, but no advantage. It does not have an advantage. It captures no value. Firm I has the lowest cost of these three competitors, but no advantage, right? So having the highest willingness to pay does not mean you have an advantage. Having the lowest cost does not mean you have an advantage. And in fact, right, firm G does not have, notice firm G does not have a higher willingness to pay than all its rivals. Firm G does not have a lower cost than all of its rivals, right? Yet firm G still has a competitive advantage because its gap between willingness to pay and cost is greater than all of its rivals, right? The point is 3 points here. Having the highest willingness to pay among your competitors does not guarantee you advantage. Having the lowest cost among your competitors does not guarantee you advantage. And in fact, you don't need either to have an advantage. You do not need to have the highest willingness to pay, and you do not need to have lowest cost. What you need is the greatest gap between willingness to pay and cost to have advantage. So, going to this question, true or false, the firm cannot have a competitive advantage unless it generates a willingness to pay which is higher than the willingness to pay of all its rivals. Well, we just saw that's not necessary. Firm G did not have a willingness to pay higher than all its rivals, and or incurs a cost to produce that is lower than the cost of all its rivals. That also, firm G didn't have that either, right? You don't need either, right? You need to have the largest gap between willingness to pay and cost, right? And so the question is, a firm cannot have a competitive advantage unless it has one and or two? No, that is a false statement, right? So that's question 10. All right, we've already done 11, right? We did out of order. So here's question 12. Again, which locations in this diagram? Okay, I'm back after pausing again. Sorry. So question 12, again, a thumbs up question, but I'll go through this briefly. Which locations in the diagram below represent achievable and potentially optimal strategic positions? So the key is, of course, achievable and optimal, or potentially optimal, right? Because we know that question B, by definition, position B is not achievable, right? Beyond the productivity frontier, by definition, is impossible. That's what the productivity frontier means. It is a frontier beyond which you cannot go, given the current state of knowledge, right? Locations C and E are off the frontier. They are underperforming. They are, as we'll find out later, having low operational effectiveness or suboptimal operational effectiveness. So those are not potentially optimal strategic positions. And so you always want a position somewhere along the frontier. So the answer is that A, D, or F. It's not just D, but A, D, or F. Any one of them could be a optimal strategic position. So that's why answer C was the correct answer, that 90% or more of you got correct. Question 13, using the same diagram, which movement represents improvement in operational effectiveness rather than a reduction in operational effectiveness or a change in strategic positioning, right? So let's first talk about these movements. They have A to D. So these movements are from location A to D, that arrow there, or is it from location F to A, movement there, from location A to C, it's a movement in that direction, from location E to D, and from location D to F, right? So, all right, so those are our options. What do these movements mean? Well, the movements among A, D, and F, remember we already said those are actually potentially optimal strategic positions. So movements from A, D, and between A to D, D to F, or A to F, all those movements are changes in strategic positioning, right? Now, operational effectiveness is movement towards, as we'll see later, towards the productivity frontier, right? And so, therefore, we see that movements A to C and E to D. So both movements A to C and E to D are both changes in operational effectiveness, but only E to D is an improvement in operational effectiveness, actually moving towards the frontier, improving both in terms of differentiation and relative cost position at the same time. So movement E to D is the only one that is actually a improvement in operational effectiveness. So that's why answer D, from location E to location D, was the answer for question 13. All right, question 14. Okay, so this is now we have our second challenging question. Question 14. Which of the following best corresponds to what Porter would describe as a variety-based positioning? Is it offering a broader variety of product or services than competitors? Is it about seeking to serve a broader variety of customers than competitors? Is it about offering a focused, tailored, or limited variety of product or services? Which of those is it? Well, this has to do with, remember we had the what, where, or how strategy. This question deals with the where strategy. Scope, right? The scope is asked sort of where or what space or environment does the organization seek to achieve its advantage, right? So we're concerned with questions like variety. What products or services does the organization provide? In the needs dimension, what set of customers does it serve? And in the access dimension, in what locations and via what channels does the organization seek to serve its customers? So what Porter calls variety-based positioning is really about the product or service scope, what you typically call product scope, service scope, right? The idea here is think about, again, if you're choosing which in this simple, clip art example, which fruit you're going to sell, right? A variety-based positioning would be one that is based on saying I'm going to offer certain fruit, not others, right? I'm going to sell apples, bananas, and pears, but I'm not going to serve, or produce or sell oranges and strawberries. So if that's the foundation of your positioning, that's a variety-based positioning, and that's you're defining and limiting your product or service scope. The other most common form of scope is the customer scope, right? What is our target market? Things like that. This is what Porter would call needs-based positioning. About basically, is your positioning based on serving a particular set of customers, right? Some customers and not others, right? And providing them whatever they need, right? Whatever product variety they need, right? But it's all focused on serving that customer segment, those customer groups. And then the access-based positioning is basically about choosing the channels or locations by which you access those customers, right? So either it could be location-based, it could be rural, urban, it could be certain states and not others. It could be the West, you saw with Coors Beer initially and not the East, or it could be access-based, right? So this example, you could choose in this example, again, just depending upon clip art here, we do over-the-counter sales and phone sales, but not online sales, not mail order sales or door-to-door sales, right? Those are different ways you can add. Those are access-based or channel-based positioning. So, all right. But what is then variety-based positioning? So variety-based positioning is about is a positioning based on serving a particular set of products, right, and not others. And to use Porter's language, so Porter says from his What is Strategy article, he says positioning can be based on producing a subset of an industry's product or services. I call this variety-based positioning. So in other words, if your positioning is based on producing a subset, that's the key word, of an industry's product or services, that is variety-based positioning. In other words, variety-based positioning is about limiting the variety of product or services offered, right? So in other words, all positioning is based on saying no, about making trade-offs, about offering a certain set of things you do. I serve these customers, not these. I use these channels, not these. I produce these products, not these. And a variety-based positioning is one that is based on the variety of the products, and in particular, limiting the variety of product or services offered. So, going back here, is a variety-based positioning one about offering a broader variety of product or services than competitors? No. The language or the wording might make you think that, but that's actually the opposite of a variety-based positioning. Is it about seeking to serve a broader variety of customers than competitors? No, that is not it. Instead, is it about offering a focused, tailored, or limited variety of product or services? Yes, that is what a variety-based positioning is. Answer C is the correct positioning. Again, the language can be misleading, but that is what Porter is talking about when he talks about variety-based positioning. All right, question 15. So we're getting there. So this is about the tailored activity systems. This is a thumbs-up question, so it's not too hard. So true or false, tailored activity systems with a high degree of fit or internal alignment face the difficulty that changing policies or procedures in one activity area may undermine the performance or effectiveness of policies or procedures in other activity areas, right? And again, this is what we saw with the Coors case study, right? The idea of you have an activity system that's tailored to a particular set of choices. When you try to make certain changes, when Coors went from one beer to many products, went from Western only to national, right? It can undermine the performance or effectiveness of policies or procedures in the other activity areas. That is the idea of fit. Is the idea of systems thinking or systems of activities. You make a change here, and has ripple effects throughout the system. So the answer there is, of course, true. All right. Question 16. So this is applying that exactly to Coors, right? Which of the following was not an example of advantageous alignment or fit between different activity choices at Coors in 77? Back when it was achieving operating profit per barrel nearly twice that of other major rival brewers. So again, we're trying to say which of these is not an example of fit between activity choices, right? Which one activity choice is aligned with another. So A, distribution in the Western region only, and the mystique associated with scarcity or limited availability. Yes, those things fit together. You're only distributing the West, and you have mystique because you're not available, because of scarcity and limited availability. So those two things aligned, right? Limited distribution and the mystique were aligned. B, backward integration into input supply and a single brewery located close to those input sources, right? Okay, so yeah, so backward integration makes more sense. In other words, owning your own inputs makes more sense when you are located near those input sources, because you have one brewery. You don't have to have many breweries that are spread far apart, therefore distant from your Rocky Mountain spring water, for example. C, focus on a single product or brand and highly efficient packaging lines. Yes, if you want to have very efficient packaging lines, having not a lot of product changeover is going to be key. So therefore, having a single product or brand is key. And finally, D, minimal advertising and a premium high price strategy. Well, first of all, those two things are inconsistent. You spend less on advertising. The whole point of advertising is to increase volume and or price that you can achieve. So therefore, minimal advertising would be inconsistent with a premium price strategy, right? Typically, you would want to, on a per unit basis, you'd spend a lot on advertising or promotion to achieve that higher price, and we saw that with Anheuser-Busch. And second, that wasn't actually the case, right? Coors was not premiumly priced, right? We saw their revenue per barrel was lower than Anheuser-Busch, even after adjusting for things like transportation costs, right? So answer D is clearly the one thing that is not an example of advantageous alignment or fit between the different activity choices at Coors in 77. All right, question 17, bad strategy, right? Which of the following is not identified as either a hallmark or root of bad strategy in the concept reading on the perils of bad strategy, right? Well, Brummel actually talks about 4 hallmarks of bad strategy. One is mistaken goals of strategy. Another is failure to face the problem. Another is fluff. The fourth one, not listed here, right, is the bad strategic objectives. Right? But those are his 4 hallmarks. And then he asks the question, okay, if those are the hallmarks, in other words, the identifying characteristics of that strategy, what's causing it? What are the roots of this? And he identifies in that reading 2 roots. He identifies the inability to choose and the template-style strategy, right? Which therefore leaves narrow focus, right? Narrow focus actually is an important element of good strategy, right? Choosing to focus, the core of strategy about focus and trade-offs, right? So again, the answer here is C, and as you can tell from the thumbs up here, that 90% of you or more got that one correct. All right, So now I have left questions 18, 19, and 20. These are all ones that were challenging. So let's go through these last 3 questions. We're in the home stretch now, but we do have 3 challenging questions left to go. Question 18, trade-offs and positions. True or false? The presence of trade-offs across strategic positions within an industry means that ultimately only one strategic position will provide a sustainable advantage, right? So in other words, do the presence of trade-offs mean that only one position will provide advantage? Well, let's go through that. So first, and some of these are slides that I just created just for this presentation. Okay. So the first is this idea of, remember, what do we mean by trade-offs? Trade-off is about some incompatibility or conflict or mismatch, right? It could be across strategic positions, right? So that whole balance of advantages, there's some trade-off across positions, some between scope choices, right? There's some incompatibility, conflict, or mismatch between different scope choices, or among activity choices, right? You cannot choose to do activity this way and another and something else, or some trade-off between or mismatch between certain activity choices. Where are those coming? What are the sources of those trade-offs? Well, it could be an incompatible product or service features or attributes, right? The idea that, look, you're not going to, McDonald's hamburgers are never going to be appealing to the locavore vegetarian. The person who's eating vegetarian and only eating local is not going to be wanting to get McDonald's hamburgers that are probably globally sourced, right, and obviously not vegetarian. It could be an inconsistency in image or reputation, right? Ferrari is going to have a conflict in its image if it tries to sell minivans, or it's going to either not be seen as where you go for minivans, or the minivans are not, or it's going to undermine Ferrari's brand image. It could be differences in optimal configuration of activities, right? Edward Jones, you had your reading on Can You Say What Your Strategy Is, right? Which talked about Edward Jones, their choices and their distinct activities in the broker market. Well, they are not going to be compatible with a hedge fund day trader, right? That person is not going to want to be dealing with Edward Jones, certainly not as their exclusive broker, because the activity system is just not designed to serve that trader. Or it could be that it's hard to do both because of limits on internal coordination, motivation, and control. This is our whole corporate strategy module, right? The idea of a diversified conglomerate, right? There could be a conflict between having a tailored niche service, right? If you, instead of doing many, many different things, it's hard to sort of coordinate and control and motivate all these sorts of things because you end up doing so many different things instead of focusing on doing one thing very, very well. So these are all potential sources of trade-offs. How do they manifest themselves? Well, one thing, think about how it manifests itself in terms of scope, okay? So here's our product or services on the left and our customers or users on the right. So here's the logic. With trade-offs, if you have trade-offs across positions, in other words, trade-offs across scope, right, what that means is strength in one area comes at the expense of weakness in other areas. That is the definition of a trade-off, right? So therefore, you cannot optimally provide all products or services to all customers, right? That's because there are trade-offs, right? So business A might choose to do, apples, oranges, and bananas. They might choose to sell those to these 2 customers there, those customer groups there. But again, you can't optimally do everything. So you got to pick and choose, right? You must choose what not to do. You have to choose which products not to do or which customers not to do, because you cannot do everything, because there are trade-offs. So therefore, an organization will optimally make distinct choices tailored to a position. It will choose which customers, which products, based on a positioning. And a different firm, therefore here business B will, they're going to sell strawberries and pears, right? They're going to choose to sell to these other customers. But the point is, the presence of trade-offs means that you have to optimally choose different positions. Firms cannot all choose the same positions. Without trade-offs across positions, however, the strength in one area does not create weakness in other areas, right? And therefore, you can optimally provide all product service to all customers. So if you don't have trade-offs, you can do everything. That's what it means, right? So business A will sell all product services to all customer groups because there's no trade-offs, right? And so therefore, there's no need to choose what not to do. So all organizations will ultimately choose to make the same choices given the same position. So now another business comes along and they're going to choose to do the same thing. Why wouldn't they? There's no trade-offs. So you're leaving money on the table if you don't do everything. So the absence of trade-offs means that the firms end up doing the same thing, right? Trade-offs are necessary for them to choose to do different things. The absence of trade-offs means that firms end up, having to compete to do the same thing because there's no trade-off among positions. This similarly applies in the balance of advantages. So remember this diagram here? right? We've already seen it a couple times here. So the productivity frontier means it's some inherent trade-off between advantages, right? So you've got to sort of, you've got a position on that frontier, but you cannot increase both, your differentiation and your low-cost position at the same time. That's the notion of the productivity frontier. So strategic positioning, therefore, is about choosing a unique point along that frontier. So without trade-offs, what it means is, without trade-offs across advantages, improvement in one advantage would not compromise other advantages, right? So you could actually improve in both dimensions at the same time. So there's no need to choose a balance of advantages. You don't need to choose strategic positioning. You don't need to choose a balance of advantages. So in fact, what it means is you can always improve in both dimensions. So there's actually no productivity frontier. If there's no trade-offs, there is no productivity frontier. So that disappears. So now competition is simply a race to the upper right. We want to increase differentiation, and we have lower costs. There's no trade-offs, so therefore all firms are going to be going are going to be competing in the same race, going in the same direction. That's what happens without trade-offs. But with trade-offs across advantages, that means the productivity frontier defines the points at which there is a trade-off across advantages. It means that you've got to, at some point, you get to a point where if you want to increase your differentiation, you've got to do so at higher cost. If you want to lower your cost, you have to do so at the expense of lower differentiation. Right? So once your organization reaches that frontier, they must choose how to balance the advantages. That is where strategic positioning comes into play. So organizations choose different positions with different balances across advantages. So again, the presence of trade-offs are necessary for firms to choose different positions. Otherwise, they would all choose the same position. I gave this example in the lecture during IA4. Remember this? I talked about strategic positioning department store. I said, look, you get Nordstrom at the high end, Walmart at the low end. They're both department stores, very different, right? But they're both department stores. The point being, I said, look, the lesson is that there's always ideal to be somewhere along the productivity frontier, but there's usually not only one solitary optimal position on the frontier. There may be multiple positions which can sustain superior performance, and the optimal positioning may vary by organization and situation, right? This slide appeared again in the lecture in IA4. Also, understand what does this mean for trade-offs when it comes to activities. So we've talked about trade-offs when it comes to scope, trade-offs when it comes to balance of advantages. What about trade-offs and activities, right? Trade-offs and activities means there's no one best way to perform functions, right? The idea is that we saw this with Coors and Anheuser-Busch, for example. They had very different activity choices, but they both could have been right for their own positioning. So without trade-offs, all organizations should perform activity the same way, right? If there was no trade-off to having one big brewery, then everybody would do it. If there was no trade-off to being national, then everybody would do it. If there was no trade-off to having multiple brands, everybody would do it, right? So the idea is without trade-offs, all organizations should perform this activity the same way, and therefore competition is about operational effectiveness, not strategy, right? The whole point is that it's all about choosing best practices, and everybody's trying to imitate each other. With trade-offs, however, the optimal activity choice in one area depends on other choices, right? So the best marketing activity might depend on the scope choice, or production activity, etc. So the choice in one area depends on another. So the presence of trade-offs highlights the importance of internal alignment or fit. So, and remember, the idea of strategy is about competing to be unique. It's about being different. That's what strategy is about, right? So remember this slide here. We talked about traditional thinking is about competing to be the best, but strategic thinking is about competing to be unique, right? And in particular, I'm not going to go through everything on this slide. You've seen it before a couple times, actually. But competing to be unique means that you're running a different race. There's more than one winner. All parties can gain. You target specific segments, right? The point is strategic positioning in the presence of trade-offs means you're making different choices, choosing different positions, and all parties can gain. There's more than one winner. So, all of that said, going back to our question, true or false, the presence of trade-offs across strategic positions within an industry means that ultimately only one strategic position will provide a sustainable advantage? No, quite the opposite, right? Trade-offs are actually the reason that there can be multiple strategic positions which provide sustainable advantage. If there were no trade-offs, there would be only one strategic position, but it's trade-offs that are actually driving that. So this answer is false. All right. That's question 18. Very detailed discussion, but I think very important to understand what we just went through. Question 19. What about identifying trade-offs? We already defined them, right? But which of the following is not an example of a managerial choice involving making a new strategic trade-off or increasing an existing trade-off, right? So we have 5 examples here, and the question is which one of these is not about making a strategic trade-off? So let's focus first, let's talk about A and B. So A says taking action to raise customer willingness to pay. but consequently incurring some additional cost. Whereas B is about taking action to lower cost, but consequently incurring some decrease in customer willingness to pay. Well, this is our balance of advantages discussion here. Remember, strategic positioning is about choosing a unique point along the productivity frontier, right? Because there is an inherent trade-off between the advantages. Well, what that means is you are essentially saying you are choosing how weak to be in one advantage in order to be strong in another advantage. That's what strategic positioning means. How weak are you willing to be in one dimension in order to be strong in the other? So what that says is, again, in terms of taking action to raise customer willingness to pay, but consequently incurring some additional costs, yes, that is the classic example of strategic trade-off. Or taking action to lower costs, but consequently incurring some decrease in customer willingness to pay, yes, that is a classic strategic trade-off in terms of the balance of advantages. All right, let's we'll take it out of order here. Let's go to D. What about limiting your ability to competitively produce certain products in order to gain advantage producing certain other products, right? Okay, well, again, the scope choice here. In particular, we're talking about products, so this is the variety of positioning on the left. Why would you ever choose not to do everything? Because the idea is doing everything, you cannot do everything optimally, right? The whole point is that a trade-off among your scope choice means you cannot optimally do everything. Choosing to do certain activities means you cannot do others. Choosing to produce certain products means you cannot optimally produce others. That is a classic trade-off in terms of scope choice. So again, answer D, limiting your ability to competitively produce certain products in order to gain an advantage producing certain other products. Yes, that is the classic example of a scope trade-off. What about E? So we'll do this again, we'll go back to C, but E, limiting your options for growth as a result of tailoring your activities to optimally serve a particular market or segment, right? Well, this is going to be our story of the growth trap, right? So the growth trap, remember what this was. So the downside of scope trade-offs, when you have scope trade-offs, in other words, you cannot do two different scope choices optimally, right? It makes it difficult to transfer or broaden your advantage, right? So the trade-offs between scope choices mean you can't broaden your scope and compete optimally in both positions. You are sort of trapped. You're boxed in a little bit because the idea is if you're optimally designed to do one thing, you cannot really expand beyond that in many cases. That's the idea of the growth trap or the trade-offs. In other words, the same trade-offs which prevent imitation may also prevent you from entering rival segments, right? So the trade-offs protect you. The people can't get in to get you, but you cannot, expand beyond your particular segment. So here's a quote about the growth trap from Porter in 2012. He says, quote, "Pressure to grow is among the greatest threats to strategy. Too often companies believe any growth is good growth. They have a tendency to add product lines, market segments, or geographies that blur uniqueness, create compromises, reduce fit, and ultimately undermine competitive advantage." So again, answer E, limiting your options for growth as a result of tailoring your activities to optimally serve a particular market or segment. Yes, that is a tough but very important trade-off that is made, that is captured in the growth trap. So finally, we're left then with answer C. What about changing your approach to a particular activity by adopting a new industry best practice that increases your operational effectiveness? All right. Well, this requires us to go back to our thinking about best practices and operational effectiveness. So remember this slide from lesson IA4. We talked about strategic positioning being the balance of advantages, but so the idea of strategic positioning about choosing a position along the frontier. What was operational effectiveness? Operational effectiveness was about achieving and extending best practice, about strengthening both advantages at the same time, in which there's no trade-off between advantages. In other words, the movement, whatever choice you're making, is the right choice for all firms or organizations because it improves you in all dimensions, right? So the notion of operational effectiveness, the notion of best practice, those phrases mean by definition there is no trade-off. That's what that means, right? A best practice is something that everybody should do. So, and Porter emphasizes right up front, the very first page, big font on that article, that operational effectiveness is not strategy. So, changing your approach to a particular activity by adopting a new industry best practice that increases your operational effectiveness, that's a change, it's not a trade-off, right? You are improving in all areas by definition. So again, answer C is not a strategic trade-off, so that's why that was the right answer, because the question asks you which of the following is not an example of a managerial choice involving making a new strategic trade-off, and so the answer was answer C. All right, question 20, the last one about DARPA. So which of the following would not characterize DARPA's strategic position in terms of the type of research on which it prefers to focus, right? And we have 5 descriptions, A, B, C, D, and E. Rather than read them, let's do them one at a time. So let's look at, we're going to do these out of order, so let's look at on purpose. Option B, research focused on early technology readiness levels, TRL 1 through TRL 5, rather than more well-developed technologies, TRL 5 through 9. Right? Well, we have an exhibit from that from the case, right? It says right here. Remember this. It says DARPA scope in terms of TRLs. We see that DARPA is indeed scope focusing on the early TRLs, TRL 1 through 5, and not the later TRLs that might be part of, the standard defense acquisition process or even JCTDs, et cetera. So DARPA is choosing, so answer B is yes. That describes DARPA's scope. They choose to focus on early technology readiness levels. What about, let's choose C, research that builds a bridge between concepts lying off existing technology roadmaps and potential near or midterm field applications, right? Well, building a bridge between things off the roadmaps and the near-term applications. Well, this is actually directly another exhibit in the case study. This is one of the exhibits in the case, can't remember which one, but DARPA defined DARPA scope about building a bridge. This is directly out of one of DARPA's strategic plans. The idea that they see the horizontal axis is the time frame, the vertical axis is the level of investment, but we have near, mid, and far term sort of application, right? And there's this fundamental research. We have short term investments supporting known requirements, and long term these concepts lying off existing roadmaps with far term sort of far field, if you will, application. And DARPA sees its role as building a bridge, between those two, filling that gap, right? Building a bridge between the concepts lying off the existing roadmaps and more short-term or near-term application. So again, what did we say? This was C, research that builds a bridge between concepts lying off existing technology roadmaps and potential near or midterm field applications. Yes, that is exactly what they define themselves. In fact, that is, again, how they describe themselves in their strategic plan. Let's go to question E. Research individual services are unlikely to support because it is too risky, does not fit their specific role, or challenge existing systems. Well, let's look again directly at DARPA's strategic plan. This was also one of the exhibits. The following, from DARPA's strategic plan, DARPA emphasizes research that the services are unlikely to support because it is risky, it does not fit their specific role or missions, or it challenges existing systems or operational concepts. DARPA focuses on capabilities military commanders might want in the future, not what they know they want today. DARPA insists all programs start with good ideas and good people. To pursue them, without both, DARPA will not start a program. Right? But most importantly, it emphasizes research the services are unlikely to support because it is risky, does not fit their specific role or missions, or it challenges existing systems or operational concepts. Again, that's exactly answer E. Research individual services are unlikely to support because it is too risky, does not fit their specific role, or challenges existing systems. Yes, that does characterize DARPA's strategic position. All right. So now, with that in mind, let's go then to answer A. Research more advanced than what is achievable via standard DoD acquisition processes, yet still more applied than fundamental academic research on concepts without foreseeable application. Well, remember this diagram. You were asked in your pre-class survey and probably in the class to sort of map out the different research entities that do defense research and where they're positioned in terms of balancing advanced versus applied research, right? I think it's the easiest thing to sort of identify are the first two, which are that probably the most advanced, uncertain application, all about invention, knowledge for knowledge's sake, knowledge not necessarily application, right? That is the basic university research, right? What's the most applied, right? Low risk of failure, predictable benefit, known application, right? DoD acquisition of the options you were given is certainly the one that would lie down there in terms of it's got to be, sort of a known application, right? Low risk of failure, right? Now, you could sort of debate the positioning of these things, but I think also corporate research, although it could be a little more advanced, ultimately does have to have an application. It's got to have a profit. It's got to generate returns on the investment, so there's got to be some application to it. The service, science, technology, we just saw that they do a little more advanced research, but still, it's not quite as risky as what DARPA does. DARPA is a little more risky, right? But DARPA isn't just all about just knowledge for knowledge's sake. So again, you might have positioned them along the frontier. I'm not saying this is the exact positioning, but I certainly think it's the case that DARPA is doing research that is more applied than basic academic research, but more advanced than DoD acquisition type process. So here, question A, answer A, research more advanced than what is achievable via standard DoD acquisition processes, yet still more applied than fundamental academic research on concepts without foreseeable application. Yes. Again, it's not way up in the upper left. It's not in the lower right. In that diagram, it is a balance between those two. Which leads us with answer D, pure basic research that expands fundamental understanding without consideration for practical use. Well, Another exhibit from the case was this, right? Do you have a quest for fundamental understanding, yes or no? Or the consideration of practical use, yes or no, right? And Regina Duggan, the former DARPA director, said, where DARPA lives is in Pasteur's quadrant, where you focus on both the quest for fundamental understanding and the consideration of practical use. Not, for example, in Bohr's quadrant, where it would be, up here, you're only trying to expand fundamental understanding and not concerned about practical use, right? So going back to the question, pure basic research that expands fundamental understanding without consideration of practical use, no, that is Bohr's quadrant. DARPA is in Pasteur's quadrant. They both balance fundamental understanding and consideration of practical use. So again, answer D would be the correct answer because it asks you which of the following would not characterize DARPA's strategic position. All right. Well, that's it, folks. That's questions 1 through 20 with emphasis on the ones that were most challenging. I apologize for the interruptions from my dog barking or squeaking his toy, and hopefully it still is a smooth viewing experience. And these slides, if you haven't noticed already, will be posted as well on Blackboard. Thank you.